Lara Logan, thank you for joining me again in the trenches.
I'm very glad to be here, Jeremy. You're one of my favorite people.
Can I say still South African?
Sure, of course. You know, in my heart, I mean, I'm an American citizen now, but I'm born and raised and forged, my soul forged in the fires of South Africa. So without question, you know, I have a massive loyalty in myself, you know, in my heart.
For my UK column audience who might not know you, let's go back to the start. You're from Durban. Take me back.
Well, I'm from Durban, South Africa. I started as a journalist when I was 17 years old in newspapers, and then went from a Sunday paper to a daily paper and worked all the way through college. So by the time I graduated from university, I had years of journalism behind me. Then went into television to an international news agency, Reuters, in Johannesburg, South Africa. Was one of the biggest stories in the world for a very long time, and sort of was at its zenith when I was working on that. The violence was pretty bad, and it was gearing, this was sort of in the late 80s and then the early 90s, going into the South African elections. Then I went and worked in London, worked for NBC News, ABC News, then got a job at CBS, ended up being the chief foreign correspondent and chief foreign affairs correspondent for CBS News, was a full-time correspondent at 60 Minutes, which was sort of the height, right, of American media. And known a lot for my reporting from the battlefields, Iraq, Afghanistan, but way beyond that, when I was in Angola, when I was 20 years old, reporting for Reuters television, long before anyone really knew my name, I was doing a lot of war reporting. And then, of course, hit the roadblock with cancel culture. That's when you suddenly discover that following the facts, regardless, of where they take you, was not popular. It wasn't popular in the mainstream media because we had sort of very assiduously been taken over by political interests. And so when they discover that you're very talented, they prop you, they support you. I mean, it was still a fight for me because as a woman, I really had to claw out my place on the battlefield because that was sort of the domain of men until Katie. Katie from the BBC was one of the very first women who really distinguished themselves as a war correspondent. And then you had Christiane Amanpour at CNN. And then, there were a few more, Alex Crawford from Sky and Lindsay Hilson from Channel 4. They started to come into it. But really in the United States, there wasn't anyone in network news unless they were Canadian or American. So I kind of shredded that glass ceiling and changed the way really for everyone who came, all the women who came after me. But I have this annoying habit of not being controllable because I just wasn't born that way. And I think it's in our South African DNA. I mean, we're just not controllable. You can't order me to do something because I have a conscience. So you can't tell me I can't report on something because I have a conscience. I'm not going to not report on child trafficking because it upsets people, or I'm not going to, be critical. I'm not going to say the Steele dossier as it was created is not propaganda because it was obvious from the start it was propaganda. If they wrote it about Obama, if they wrote it about Biden, I would have said the same thing because it was obvious that it wasn't true. But with Donald Trump, suddenly we encountered something so weird for me. I mean, it was unbelievable. If you spoke up for the truth, you were instantly branded as some right-wing lunatic, some Trump Nazi, and whether you supported Donald Trump or not was irrelevant. And so, then I went into kind of, it's almost like it's a tsunami. I think of it like being in a washing machine. Since 2016, I mean, I was there cheering for Obama in the beginning because we were coming out of the Bush-Cheney years, which were so awful. These people were horrible. We hated them as journalists. They lied about everything happening on the battlefield, and I exposed them. And when I exposed them, I was lifted up and everybody loved me. So, Obama gets into office. I'm full of hope, right? That was his message of hope. And I keep doing what I've always done. And suddenly nobody loves me anymore in the media, and in the power, in the halls of power. And I don't just mean Washington, D.C. I mean the halls of power, media organizations, institutions to support the media, academic institutions. I mean, all these people, the think tanks, the people that come crawling, to your door, hordes of them when you're a big voice in the media that all want a piece of you, right? And they all want you to tell their story, and they all want you to cover this, and they all want to give you an award, and they all want to do that. Suddenly, none of those people, when I kept doing what I learned to do in South Africa as a newspaper journalist, what I continued to do at CBS News as a radio, television, and newspaper journalist, when I worked at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel as a freelance writer, and all that time, I did the same thing. I asked the obvious questions. I questioned everything, and I reported what I believed to be the truth. And then suddenly, they hated me. And then they started attacking your reporting. And you don't stand a chance because you're going up against the CIA and these entire networks that they have built. And they go throughout the corporate world. They go throughout the academic world. They go throughout the PR world, the legal world. I mean, they have lines of operation into every part of your business. And then, of course, there's human nature. You know, so if you're very successful, as I was, and if you're one of the top people in television news in America, which puts you at the top in the world, and they can find something to take you down, oh boy, it's like sharks at a feeding frenzy. They smell that blood in the water, and it takes very little. And then you place a few, strategically placed assets who are pretty much on your side. They're either political operatives, or they're, whatever, or they're just corrupt, or they're just weak, jealous, whatever. And then they start with the anonymous, articles and the hit pieces and all the anonymous people that want to take you down. And so I've just, I've kept fighting because I don't know I'm a fighter, and I don't know how to do or be anything other than who I am and a journalist. That's what I was born to do. Never done anything else, and don't know how to do anything else. Never will do anything else. Although I thought about it a couple of times. I'm like, why am I still doing this to myself? But, people come to you all the time. They say, thank you for being our voice. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for not, falling on your knees and crawling in the dirt like the others. Thank you for not taking the hand and becoming corrupt. Thank you for being so brave, blah, 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 blah. But you know what they don't do, Jeremy? They want you to take all the risk, and they want, to prop you up, but they don't want to take any risk. So you're left. You're left fighting this battle, which is an endurance marathon. But it's okay because it is what it is.
When you're talking about meeting cancel culture, were you referring to the Benghazi 60 Minutes thing?
Yes, that's when I really, got my first full-blown encounter. There were sort of hints of it just leading into that. Like I did a story about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So at the time, Obama and his CIA chief were out telling the world that Al-Qaeda was decimated. They were on the run. There was less than 200 Al-Qaeda operatives left in the world, blah, blah, blah. And so I collected for 2.5 years the battlefield reports from Afghanistan. And I showed that they were capturing and killing and wounding more Al-Qaeda people in a month, in any given month, in 2.5 years than they said existed. So they were lying. So what was the first thing the Obama administration did when my story came out? They stopped all battlefield reporting to the media. They cut it off. So you had people like when I was sitting, in bars in Washington, D.C., watching Obama speak on television and cheering him on, right? Because he said it was going to be the most transparent administration ever. And we all thought, okay, finally, here's someone who's not going to lie, who's going to tell the truth about what's happening on the ground in the war, who's going to stand for principle, blah, blah, blah. So you believe those things. I mean, I had no reason to doubt him. I interviewed Obama when I was 6 months pregnant with my son. I flew to Afghanistan to interview him in Kabul, Afghanistan. They chose me, Jeremy. They chose me for their only foreign interview during Obama's campaign for the presidency in 2008. Why did they choose me? Because I had the most credibility of any journalist in the United States of America when it came to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and that region. And what did Obama lack at the time? He had no foreign policy credentials, and he was being criticized because he'd so-called, barely left the United States. So they did a foreign trip to Afghanistan, and who did they use? I didn't know at the time I was being used. You're blown away. Oh, the president's guy, David Axelrod, is calling you and he's like, you want an exclusive with the boss? And, you know, you never get those kind of exclusives, right? That hardly ever happens. So you think, wow, you're blown away. Okay, I got this exclusive. CBS is happy. You know, everybody's excited. You're flying over there. You're doing the logistics and you don't stop and think, why? Why me? Why am I nobody gives you exclusives. They don't fall in your lap. So when someone does, actually, what I've learned now is that the first thing that should happen is the hackles on your neck should rise. And you should ask yourself, why are they giving this to me? Because they've selected you to use you for a reason. Because most stories that are worth reporting, that mean something, you've got to claw them out of stone. You know, it's hard. They don't just fall in your lap. So when something falls in your lap, that's a sure sign that you need to be extra careful.
How do you navigate the fog of propaganda?
Well, part of it is experience, right? I mean, because when I think back to myself as a young reporter, I was really naive. Like I remember the first time I was assigned a story that involved, it was a criminal story, and I had to call the police. And I remember as I was a newspaper reporter, I remember calling the police and having this conversation with them, and the police officers telling me all of this. You know, and part of me, I'm a 17-year-old kid. I can't believe I'm interviewing the police chief, right? And so I'm kind of, you know, sort of blown away by this whole thing. I get off the phone and I'm like a little puppy, right? Go bounding up to the news editor who's been in this game a long time, got one cigarette hanging out the corner of his mouth, got pockmarked skin, wild hair, and to the absolute embodiment of a hardened news guy, right? Who's been doing this forever. Every second word is, you know, F this and F that, blah, blah, blah. But he knows the news. And so I come and report to, this is what I found out about the story. And he looks at me and he's like, he said, what? Did you ask him this? Did you ask him this? Oh, he's foolish. You know, he's full of crap. He's lying to you. This isn't true. That's not true. That's not true. What about this, and this? And I'm like, okay, that's how you learn, Jeremy. But we are getting rid of newsrooms. We are getting rid of the reporters that learn over time, that know, that can smell a lie a mile away, because they've been doing this for a long time and they question everything and they stay true to the principles. We've blended the lines between activist and journalist, you know, and sure, you can report on something, you know, like you can be a reporter and you report like I did on the mass graves in Kosovo, and you can become very passionate and emotional about what you're reporting on. But there are, you know, a reporter is supposed to follow the facts wherever they take them. And an activist will bury inconvenient facts if they hurt the cause. That's the definition of being an activist, is that you put the cause before everything else. So now does that mean that you won't find an activist that discovers something, you know, like corruption within their organization and comes out about it and is honest about it? Sure. I mean, you can find the 1 in a million activist who's willing to do that. And you can find the reporter that is, reporters can be very passionate about what they're working on, stories that they tell, without becoming, you know, a full-blown activist. But if you're not very careful about separating those things, then you get into a very bad space. And years ago, I met a young girl who was dying to meet me because I was a, you know, experienced journalist, and she was studying journalism, and I was one of her, you know, idols. And I said to her, "What are you studying?" And she said, "I am a human rights journalist." And I looked at her and I said, "What does that mean?" "What do you mean you're a human rights journalist?" And she looked at me like, what's wrong with her? Why is she asking me such a stupid question? What does she mean? What does it mean? And I said to her, you know, I said, you didn't tell me you're a sports journalist. Like if you're a sports journalist, I know you cover sport. But you technically take the principles and the craft of journalism and you apply them to a subject matter. But when you tell me you're a human rights journalist, I said, so like say you go to Egypt to cover a human rights issue, you're going to find out what the government of Egypt has been the victim of the previous regime right? And so now you're going to cover the new regime and all the human rights violations of the past. And what if you find out that the people that you're interviewing have committed human rights violations? What's your job then? What if Amnesty International, what if you discover that they're trafficking children? What if Human Rights Watch, you discover that they're burying murders because it doesn't, they're weighting the research to benefit one side because they're invested in that side or they get money from them. Like, what do you mean you're a human rights journalist? There is no such thing. You know, are you a human rights activist? Because then you need to go join Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. But if you're a journalist, I don't even understand what kind of college program is training you to be a human rights journalist. I mean, it's nonsense. So when you say, how do I do it? Well, I have the benefit, number one, of having been in this for more than 35 years. So I'm as cynical as it gets. I question everything and I question everyone. I've also had enough time to make mistakes. And so I've learned the importance of being as skeptical about the people I like or the people I agree with as the people I disagree with. I've also always understood that journalism is not objective. It's highly subjective. The stories you choose, the characters you focus on, whatever it happens to be. We're human. Of course, we have our own bias, but the craft of journalism, the professionalism of it, is what's supposed to protect us from our own bias, right? So if you're diligent about your craft, it can insulate you to a degree. Not always, nothing is 100%, but at least by going through the process, you begin to separate yourself from your opinions and your emotions and things like that.
That's a very interesting point, Lara. I've often wondered where that line is between getting personally involved in the story or, you know, observing it from a distance.
Yeah. Well, and how much distance, right, is the question. Because, you know, some people will say, well, why is this woman commenting on South Africa when she's thousands of miles away in America? And even though she's South African, it's been, I don't know how many years it is since I lived in South Africa. So, you know, what does she know? Versus, I'm an American journalist. I've never been to South Africa. Couldn't find it on a map, but I'm commenting because I cover the White House and that's my beat. You know, I mean, how much distance is good and how much distance is blinds you to certain realities. I think the truth is that when you're close to something, there's a certain perspective that you get and a knowledge, a depth of knowledge and a detail, hopefully, and substance, right? Because that depth means substance versus when you're further removed from it, you are without question more superficial. So for example, I can go to Mexico, which I have done. I've reported extensively on the cartels, but I've lived to fight another day. Whereas in Mexico, they kill journalists all the time. Because who's more threatening to a member of the cartel? It's the local journalist who's digging into the details of exactly who's doing what on this street corner or in this big deal or what, right? They're the real threat. So if you look at the DuPont Awards, which is the highest award for television journalism in the United States, most of the DuPonts go to the batons, go to local news reporters. Because who's really exposing the details of corruption? When I lived in Baghdad for 5 years, I knew that place backwards. But who did they want to talk to most of the time? They wanted to bring in the journalists from the United States who were famous, who had big reach, and who knew very little, quite often. Not always, but most of them didn't know a whole lot because it's easier to sell someone a narrative when they don't have a depth of knowledge. So you have this balance between beat reporting, because when a reporter has a beat, they really learn their subject. So it used to be you were the crime reporter, you were the sports reporter, you were the entertainment reporter, right? And now if you're a journalist, you should be able to move between those different beats. Now, you know, maybe here you're doing local government, now you're doing politics, now you're covering the White House, now you're a general reporter. So, right, so you can have specialists and generalists, and you learn in each of those functions. But the benefit of having beat reporters, like say you have the BBC Asia correspondent is there for years, because they really learn and understand Asia firsthand, you know? So on the one hand, proximity and closeness can be very helpful. Of course, you can get blinded by your own emotion. You can get too close to it. You can become corrupted, or you could just become, so biased that you forget to do your job. And that's why I've always liked being part of a team in journalism, right? Because inevitably we have our own perspectives, but what we would do at 60 Minutes, my team, we would argue with each other all the time. But then what you discover is when you step back from that, you see, wait a minute. So now what happens? Because every team sees certain things the same way. Certain issues like Roe v. Wade in the United States, the right to have an abortion, my body, my choice. I never heard anyone I ever worked with at ABC, NBC, CBS, or any of the other places I worked in the American media, CNN, I never heard someone say they were pro-life or, against abortion. Never. If they existed, they didn't speak up because they were outnumbered. So what you learn is that within your organization where you feel very noble, because you have these lofty goals of bringing truth to power, shining a light, blah, blah, blah. Democracy dies in darkness, right? This is our job. We are the light bearers because we are bringing light and exposing things that people need to know about. Why am I going to live in Baghdad for 5 years? Why am I going to Afghanistan in the middle of the war? Because I really believe that if people know the truth, why did I risk my life in South Africa? Because if people know the truth, when there's a major injustice happening, they're going to do the right thing. But now we live in a time where people don't want you to believe, even don't believe your lying eyes. Someone can stand in front of a riot with the flames burning and say, this is a mostly peaceful protest. Don't worry about the flames behind me. Right? So now we've got into a crazy situation where, for example, Donald Trump has to show a video because some people deny that white farmers are even being murdered. I've heard lots of people deny it. They say, "Oh, that's not happening," or "Oh, it's happening in such small numbers, it doesn't matter," or "It's minuscule numbers in comparison to all of the mostly Black people being murdered every day in the crime-ridden South Africa. Therefore, it doesn't matter." And so you're not even starting the conversation in an honest place. It's not even starting there. So like people, it's like having a story, having a conversation with someone about the Holocaust when you're talking to someone who says the Holocaust didn't happen. Because there are a lot of Holocaust deniers out there. No, it didn't happen. That's a lie. 6 million Jews didn't die. Or some people say, well, they killed them, they did it to themselves, or they did it for this reason, or whatever. There's a million different arguments, but you can't even have an honest conversation. Like we can have an honest conversation about the so-called race-based laws in South Africa. These 140 laws that were written about, I think it was by AfriForum or someone connected to AfriForum. And now that, someone else from The Guardian and from another paper, they said these are not race-based laws. But then when you look at the laws, they're all talk about, either things like equity, diversity, inclusion, and righting the wrongs of the past. Well, if the wrongs of the past were racial injustice,
but
how do you right the wrongs of the past without race being the center of that?
Sorry, Laura, but hang on. When people say when people say there aren't any race-based laws in South Africa, it's so absurd. Let me give you an example. Everybody knows that Elon Musk has got Starlink. Starlink hasn't been able to launch in South Africa
because of BEE, Black Economic Empowerment. Because Elon doesn't want to give 30% of his company to some random Black person in order to meet the legal requirements. I know.
It's
understand.
Ridiculous.
But the law doesn't. But the law. That's a case where the law actually says it has to be a Black person.
Yes. That's race-based.
Yes. Right. But what they argue about is, well, of this 140 laws, this 140 number is not accurate, right? Because at least half of these 140 laws, when you actually look at each law, you don't see the word race or you don't see the word Black or whatever it is, right? But we all know that when you see the word, equity, that's a Marxist term. When you strive for equity, that is literally one of the sort of foundations of Marxism. So what does that mean? When you see righting the wrongs of the past, that means taking from white people to give to black people. That's what it means. Or, it means that you have to give preference to black people because white people got preference in the past. That's what it means. So one person says this is a race-based law. The other person says there's no mention of race in this law. And so it's a ridiculous conversation. It's a ridiculous conversation. And then if you talk about it, then the other part that's ridiculous. Now I'm accused, I've had people say to me, did you feel persecuted in South Africa? No, of course I didn't feel persecuted, and are there many other white people who don't feel persecuted? Absolutely. Is there great unity and love and, a shared identity and togetherness among most black and white people in South Africa? 100%. But does that mean that it's okay to say that slit the throat of whiteness and then pretend that doesn't have any impact?
Kill the Boer.
Well, I mean, look, we know what the arguments are with kill the Boer. So I grew up in the days of kill the farmer, kill the Boer, when it was actually a battle cry of the resistance. Then came Peter Mokaba, and he wasn't of the time, he wasn't there in the 80s. Okay. Peter Mokaba came later in the 90s, in the early 90s. So this for me even was new generation. So they inherit these songs that are seeped in the romantic ideal of the revolution, which, by the way, is a Marxist communist revolution. But we all know that what happened to the ANC when they actually came to power, they were not Marxist. They did not install a Marxist government in South Africa. Why? Because nobody would have signed off on that. None of the power brokers that were involved in those negotiations were arguing for Marxism. And why were they really Marxist? Well, some people were Marxist at heart, but most people were Marxist because those are the people who gave them the money. Because who funded the revolution? The Russians and the Cubans. Why? Because it was a proxy war. South Africa was one of the many proxies of the Cold War. So you had in Angola, in Namibia, in Mozambique, in South Africa, you had the Cubans and the Russians and the Marxist communist countries versus the United States and the UK. But then what did you have in South Africa? Well, you had this little problem of this thing called apartheid, which no one in good conscience could actually agree was a good system. Okay. It was pushed in the wake by Hendrik Verwoerd and the Afrikaners in the wake of the Second World War because it was what was that? The first election after the Second World War, the Black Peril election, right? That was with this idea that you as a minority, the only way you're really going to survive being a minority in this country is if you band together and you create a system of control, which is really what apartheid was. Separate people, control them, right? And so, and do it based on race, and then use fear, intimidation, tyranny, force, censorship, all the tools that come with every system that isn't free, that isn't based in honesty and liberty and justice and equality. I mean, what do you have to do? Whenever you create a system like that, put whatever name you want on it. You can call it a dictatorship, like in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, which I witnessed personally. You can call it a democracy, a fake one under Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, right? You can call it a communism in Russia or in China. You call it whatever you want. But when you create a system that isn't founded in things that are true and honest and enduring, you always need the tools of tyranny, of darkness, to prop it up. It's like telling a lie. What happens to your lie? Oh, shit. It starts to crumble. Okay? Ask anybody who's ever cheated on their spouse or their partner. Tell one lie, and what do you got to do? You got to keep telling more lies to keep it up. So what happens is you build these systems based on that, and they crumble. Marxism always crumbles because what do you have to do in the end? To ensure equity over equality, you got some animals are more equal than others because the ones ensuring the system are always more equal, right? Because this runs counter to everything that's true of human nature. And what happened? So what happened? The Marxists recognized that these openings to dominate society with things like religion, things like race, these are natural openings in free societies where you can exploit people's emotions, you can exploit their misfortune, you can find a foothold for your ideology to grow, because I call them the good idea fairies, right? They come to you when you're young and they say, isn't it terrible that people starve to death? Yes. Wouldn't you prefer a system? Capitalism is responsible for this because you live in a capitalist society. Wouldn't it be better to have a system where nobody starved, nobody was homeless, nobody had to die because they couldn't afford medical care? Like, what person, if we're basically good in our hearts as human beings, who's going to say no to that? You know who says no to that? The person who says, who's going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Like, my father taught me when I would go to Musgrave Center in Durban. Remember Musgrave Center in Durban, for all the Durbanites in your audience? In South Africa, the shopping mall. And we would go after school to the welcome chair. I don't even know if it's still there. And I loved to order a buttered scone. And it was toasted. And my dad would say to me, he said, how much does that cost? And, look on the menu. And I looked at the price. And then he said, how much does that really cost? And I said, well, I mean, this scone doesn't cost more than a few cents, and they're charging this amount of money for it. My dad said, that's a ripoff, right? And I said, yeah, it's a ripoff. And he said, well, who paid for this? Who paid for the person that brought it to your table? Who's paying to clean these tables? Who paid for the furniture? Who's keeping the lights on? How far was it transported? Where is it cooked? Where did the ingredients come from? And you start to break down the supply chain. And then you start to understand what the real cost is. Right? And so these are the tools that, these are more complex things that you have to understand. What's the easy thing to do is to take people who are poor, take people who are disenfranchised, take people who are suffering and play on their emotions and then blame somebody else. You find the bad guy. So let's find the bad guy. So, I raise all of this because I want there to be no misunderstanding. I love my country and I love my people very, very, very much. And I recognize fully that South Africa has come through a difficult history and a dark past, and people gave up everything during the revolution. And those who are using this kind of song today, they're trading on that. All those sacrifices that were made, they didn't earn it. Peter Makaaba wasn't even alive in that time. Okay. And not Julius Malema, sorry, wasn't even alive during that time. They're trading on all those sacrifices that were made, all that suffering and injustice that happened. They're taking that, the romantic side of the revolution, and they're using that. But it's very obvious when you look at their policies. I mean, Malema's a Marxist, because he's funded by the Marxists. I swear, if Malema was funded by capitalists, he would be the biggest capitalist there was. These are not people who truly carry in their hearts, like Nelson Mandela said no time and time again. I was there. I lived through those days when they would offer him his freedom, and because it was conditional, he didn't take it. You think Julius Malema would stay in prison?
No.
For the sake of his people? You think Julius Malema is ever going to live like the people that keep him propped up? Or the people that he speaks to? You think he's not going to live like that. Neither, by the way, does Jacob Zuma, and neither, by the way, does Cyril Ramaphosa. Look at these people, at the money that they have amassed. And I don't understand why. This is one thing that I've encountered is very hard for a lot of South Africans, especially a lot of the white South Africans that I've talked to. There's something where they go blind, Jeremy. And it's at this point where they can't recognize that you can be honest about apartheid. You can be honest about how this has benefited white people. You can be honest about all of this stuff and where we are today. But they still think that taking away commercial farmland from white farmers and giving it to people who are never going to farm it and are never going to turn that land into something productive is a real solution. And somehow, if you acknowledge that white farmers are being murdered in what can be argued is a genocide, that somehow that means that you're blind to everything else. And also, why can they not recognize that there are globalist forces that are at work in South Africa? I mean, one of the biggest, most vocal people, the first time the land expropriation thing came up years ago, one of the most vocal people who was outspoken on this issue was Patrick Gaspard, who was the U.S. ambassador to South Africa at the time under Obama. Why was Patrick Gaspard out there encouraging land expropriation? We all know land expropriation does not lead to a better place. It doesn't. I mean, you could say it rights the wrongs of the past, okay, and maybe it'll make people feel better. But the reality is, 30,000 commercial farms in South Africa, most of them farmed by white people. People will starve to death. And as I tell people all the time, millions will starve, and most of them will be black. But you know who won't starve? Julius Malema, head of the Economic Freedom Frontier. Cyril Ramaphosa, head of the ANC. Right? Jacob Zuma, head of MK. All the big leaders in South Africa, none of them will suffer. None of them. Not one. And what have they done? You know, a woman who was very close to me, Florence Maduna, who was, I knew all my life until she died. She lived in my mother's apartment for years before she finally died. And that was because when she got sick, I insisted she move out of her shack and live in my mom's place. And I was always asking her, Florrie, please, can I get you a house? And she used to say no. I say, why not? She said, because the ANC promised me a house and they're going to keep their promise. They're going to keep their word. How many people did they let down? How many people? Millions. And it's not getting better. It's getting worse. And people say, you know, certain people say, oh, well, it was fine until Jacob Zuma got into power. No, it wasn't. It wasn't fine. They were not investing in infrastructure in that time. From day one of the first things that happened is they stopped investing in infrastructure, in the roads, in the grid, in the water systems from day one. I mean, it didn't drop off 100%, but it started to go down. It was going downhill from the beginning.
Lara, why did you leave South Africa?
Wow, it was so long ago, you know, I've even forgotten why I left South Africa. You know, honestly, when I left, I never left. I thought I was going for a time. I always believed I would come home. I had a vision of a little house on the water. I always loved Glendudno. So expensive, I couldn't afford it, but I always thought that I would come home. And I love Durban, you know, that's where I was born and raised. But I never left. I went to follow my instinct, which was I understood that South Africa's place in the world. I think one of the things that makes us interesting as South Africans is that we've always understood that we're not the center of the universe. We just know that, right? We're not in Europe. We're not in the United States. We're not the center of the universe. We don't drive the global agenda. And we're okay with that. I mean, you know, I don't know about you, but a lot of us we're okay with that. But what we have is, you know, we have something else. Like, we were born in this place that was truly blessed by God. I mean, look at South Africa. Look how we grew up. I mean, I go to beaches. I've been to beaches all over the world. I've been to the south of France. I've been all up the Gold Coast in Australia. I have been to beautiful beaches in Florida. I have been, you know, to beaches all over Europe. I've been to the best beaches in the UK when people will say, oh, the UK beaches are terrible, but there's some great beaches here. And you go there and you look at it and you're like, what is this? You know, what is this? You call this a beach? Let me tell you about this place called South Africa, right? So you're blessed. I mean, we are there in the center of life. We may not be the center of the world or the center of geopolitics, but in this place where life began on Earth, where every inch of ground is teeming with life of some kind, where you really get to experience life in all kinds of extremes, right? That's why I said forged in the fires of Africa, right? So I was born in this incredibly beautiful place, but then you do start to realize, wait a minute, I'm still going to fundraisers where people are raising money to build wells in Africa. I've been doing this for 30, 40 years now. How come there's nowhere in Africa where you can point to and say, they don't have a water problem anymore? All these people that are building schools, and yet there's nowhere? There's not one single village where you can say they have a great functioning school system? Or all these organizations that have been raising money to save animals. What animals have they saved, Jeremy? What? I can't hear you. You know what I mean? So you start out as this idealistic person, and I'm in with the World, Wildlife Foundation. Oh, look at this great work they're doing in Africa. And look at these great people who are doing work in Africa. And you start to realize, wait, all these people are just stealing. They're just stealing. They created, so you have this continent that was, not to say that, African politicians and corruption and all kinds of things. And the continent is very different. Southern Africa versus East versus West versus the North. And, we all know Egypt is nothing, like Angola, right? So I'm not meaning to put it all together the way a lot of people do when they don't know the place. But I just mean that you have country after country, whether it's former Democratic Republic of Congo. There is arguably not a single piece of ground on earth that is richer and more blessed in mineral wealth than the former Democratic Republic of Congo. And yet 80% of the population lives on $1 or less a day. How did that happen? So you have to start looking at that. Well, how did that happen, right? And so there's individual responsibility, and then there's, the sort of the external forces that are part of that. And you start to look at all that. So I just understood that being in this place called South Africa, I was on the one hand incredibly blessed, but on the other hand, I was given, what were my blessings from God? My blessings were that I had a near photographic memory in many respects. I had the ability to grasp strategic things and tactical things. I could see through things, and I could see through people. I had the ability to go, like, I saw everybody. We're raised in South Africa. Everybody was equal to me. Whether I'm sitting down with street kids, sleeping with street kids on the streets of Luanda in Angola, or whether I'm sitting down with the Secretary of Defense, or I'm at the White House, or I'm being honored by the Queen of England, by her son and his wife, who are having dinner with me in my honor to give me an award from the Queen. Right? It doesn't, or I'm meeting Obama for the first time in the Afghan embassy when I'm 6 months pregnant, or whatever it is. Like, is I think in South Africa, to me, I was raised to see all people as equally deserving of respect, kindness, love, and protection under the law. And then you discover, wait a minute, there's a country called the United States where these things are enshrined in this covenant with God and built into the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and so on. Like, they actually founded a country like that. It's not to say that the United States is better than every country on earth. I'm not saying that. But if you look at how other nations were founded, they don't have that. We didn't have that in South Africa. God is not important to us in South Africa. I mean, most of the South Africans that I know are very secular. We looked at religion as white, English-speaking South Africans. We looked down on religion. You know what I mean? I mean, sure, that my mother was in a convent, and she was a lapsed Catholic, and so I had some grounding in Catholicism and religion. But I mean, mostly South Africa is very secular. I mean, unless you're talking about in the Black community, where you still have, of course, traditional religions, right? But look at it. What's the fastest growing religion in South Africa? I mean, I don't know the statistics, but it's pretty obvious it'd be Islam, right?
I'm not sure. It's a good question.
Because look at what's growing all over the world. It's not, I mean, there's pockets where Christianity is growing, but everywhere that Islam is, it's growing. Everywhere, right? It's not declining in Saudi Arabia, and it's certainly not declining in London, or, by the way, the United States. But what is declining all over the world? Christianity. What is being rejected by people all over the world? Christianity. So anyway, I say this to you because my instincts were always to go to the heart of the story. And it would, when I was growing up under apartheid, I was in the heart, living in the heart of one of the biggest stories in the world. And then I went to Angola during the war and Mozambique during the war. So in my region and in my sphere, I went to the heart of all those big stories. And then it was just natural for me to keep doing that. So I did that going across the world, and I went to Iraq and I went to Afghanistan and stayed there for years and years. And, it was very obvious that America was kind of the epicenter of this. I wasn't really British in nature. Like, I worked for a British company, and I didn't really identify with the British kind of passive aggressive thing. I was more, my fiery South African, Irish, Sicilian roots I identified more with the new world of the United States, where if you could demonstrate real skill and you could work your way up, that wasn't, there's limits. There's more limits to that in the British sort of system. And in America, I knew there would be no limits for me. I knew that as far as I could go, I just believed I could do it. And so I did that. And then something happened to me. And I know I'm giving you a very long answer to a simple question, but I'll tell you, then this happened. I had babies.
Yes.
And it was over. My African dream was over. My dream of returning to South Africa to live out the rest of my life in the place, that I love so much. That was it, because once you have kids, everything changes.
No, for sure. Well, I mean, the most important question, Lara, of all the questions I have to ask you is, kan jy nog Afrikaans 'n klein bietjie verstaan?
Jou gat, my skat. Ja, sekerlik. Wat soek jy met my?
Do you miss Durban?
Oh yeah, of course. Of course I do. I mean, I love what I love about the South African people. Like I don't know, there's just a genuineness to your relationships and interactions with everybody, right? I mean, there just is, and there's so much love. And in spite of all the suffering of the vast majority of people there, of course, most of whom were Black, but there were many of us that were in the trenches with them. And there was such joy. I have so much respect. Like, I just have so much respect. I mean, I knew Mandela wasn't like we were best buddies on first name terms, but I was a journalist in his time and his every move, and we were always around him. And, he would host a breakfast with us, and we would go and have breakfast with him, a bunch of journalists. And I actually had one interaction with him where the Queen of England came to South Africa on her first official visit after he was elected.
I remember that.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So that was crazy covering that. And we had a pool coverage and all the rest of it. And I was one of the main people in that because I was part of Reuters news agency. And, the agencies always have to do everything. And we would deal with the correspondents, and they had other jobs to do. They had to write their scripts and all that. So we were, like the gatherers of all the news and information. And we had to put it out, but not, the way they did. And so we were right at the center of this. And it was just, those royal visits are just insane. And so we get to the end, the very last day, and the Queen hosted a reception for the media on the HMS, her ship that was in the port there in Cape Town. And, we had to go and curtsy for the Queen and shake hands with Prince Philip and so on and so on. And I'm leaving the ship with all the journalists, and I scrape my Achilles on the back of a step, which was just pure metal. So it's... Okay, and I'm bleeding everywhere. And the Queen says, take care of her. So some sailor carries me. I'm not kidding you, Jeremy. Some sailor carries me a few, below deck into the bows of this ship, and they patch it up, and I go back. But now I'm late for the official banquet which is marking the end of the Queen's visit. So I come running into the hotel like a bat out of hell, and it's the Cape Sun, and I go to the elevator, and I'm on the elevator button because I'm frantic now to change for the dinner and get down there. And I just hear this voice, and it's, "Hello, Lara, how are you?" And I turn around, and it's like, there's the President of South Africa waiting to receive the Queen of England. And as always, Mandela has his security, but he never let them cut him off from the people. And so I'm just like, "Madiba, how are you?" And you and I stood there for like 20 minutes chatting to him until the Queen got there.
And like you said earlier, it's part of you. You'll always be a journalist at heart and a journalist in reality, the word has got such a tainted meaning these days, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And it's the thing I worry about, Jeremy, is that I'm all for embracing new forms of media, and I understand that we're in a new era of technology, and people are breaking away from the formal media structures of the past, and I understand why. I mean, hell, I've been targeted, falsely labeled as extreme right wing, and all the rest of it, and but at the same time, the infrastructure that allowed me to go all over the world and witness things firsthand is breaking down, and nothing is replacing it yet. Now, that doesn't mean something won't happen, but where's the newsroom? Where's there, like, it's great that anyone with a microphone can be a podcaster. Okay. But, how are they going to survive financially? How much, where are they investing in the next generation of journalists? Who's coming in there and learning firsthand from them? Who are the mentors? Who are you handing over? Like, there's tons of journalists that I know, very experienced, very knowledgeable. Where is their knowledge going? They're taking it to the grave with them because you know what I mean? And so journalists have stopped being journalists. So you get a lot of people in mainstream media that have a lot of skill and experience, but they've lost their moral courage, or they're ideologically blinded, or some of them are political operatives, or some of them are corrupted, and paid off, or some of them are so bought in and entrenched, and they're, in the role that they've played in the many false narratives that have been around for the last 10 years or so. So they don't want to, they don't want to break out of that. It's like people that don't want to admit that the vaccine has killed more people than COVID in many places, because then they have to admit that maybe they're at risk, right? Or they vaccinated their kids and put their kids at risk. They didn't know any better, but they'd rather not believe it. It's harder to face that reality than it is to go on believing the lie. So you have part of that is at play in the media world. But as long as the media remains unwilling or unable, as that formal corporate infrastructure, to acknowledge the truth and to correct it, to invest in correcting it, then you can pretty much write that off, right? And then when you look at, new media, so a lot of people define themselves as conservative media. I get it. That's sort of that's not how I define myself. And I don't like, as a journalist, that kind of goes against the grain for me. But I do recognize that there are people, and especially the way social media is today, that there are people sort of who are defined by their political view, and there's room for that, no question. The opinion pages in a newspaper, speak to that. So there's always been room for analysis and opinion. The problem is that there isn't really a home for people who don't belong to the left and they don't belong to the right. Nobody wants us. And as long as there's no money in it, you will not know what's happening right on your doorstep. Like, a good example is in the United States, in North Carolina, right before the election, they had that absolute catastrophic flood. Well, what's happening in North Carolina now? What's happened to those people? Where's the firsthand reporting? No one's investing in that. You have an entire state of California, which is coming apart at the seams. And how many people are reporting on that issue firsthand and showing the growing number of homeless tents that line the Pacific Coast Highway? And what does that mean? And challenging, it's not happening. There's no investment in reporting. And it's partly because we, as journalists, as an industry, have yet to own our failures. We're still in the front lines of an ideological war.
How can I follow you?
Well, I have my show, Going Rogue with Lara Logan, which is a podcast it's on X, it's on YouTube until they until they kick us off. It's on Rumble. You can find it on laralogan.com, and Substack, and basically any platform out there that we can be on. We're on Spotify. So if people, you know, we tried going on TikTok, by the way, we got a couple strikes straight out of the box. So I don't know how long we'll survive on TikTok, but I would really love people to watch my show because, you know, I'm taking on some very significant topics, everything from satanic accelerationist cults, which are these people who believe that by committing evil, they can accelerate the decline of humanity, and the role that they have to these mass shootings in America. Trafficking, high-level trafficking in the music industry, you know, lawfare in the United States, which affects everything the Trump administration is doing right now. So, I mean, you know, we're the people love the show very much, and I think it's sort of because people are starved of substantial information, right? They want substance. They don't want just the headlines. There's room for just the headlines. We all need that. Sometimes in the morning, you just want to know what the news is, right? But there's a lot of people that want to go beyond the headlines, and that's kind of the nature of the show.
Well, on that note, my favorite African-American journalist, Lara Logan, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We'll talk soon, okay?